First time that we have a Prime Minister who has not held a single press conference. This attitude is manifested from the top when the leader himself or herself adopts a hostile attitude, refuses to meet the press and take questions, refuses to give interviews except where the questions are all screened and prepared beforehand. Aap aam kaise khate ho? All that's fine. If the government doesn't like the coverage of a news channel or a newspaper on certain issues, the minister can pick up the phone, call the owner, and things can change. The fact is that it is not the job of the media to put forward the government's point of view. But media in a democracy cannot be reduced to being a mouthpiece of the government. It is my belief, my experience, and the experience of my colleagues that we are passing through a situation in India today where the extent of government hostility is at the highest it has been for years, for decades. A section of the Information Technology Rules of 2021 to direct or to order YouTube and Twitter to delete all links to the documentary. Courts are not beyond criticism. The Home Minister and various senior BJP leaders openly criticized the Supreme Court's Sabarimala judgment, wrote long articles about it, eventually managed to get it reversed in some ways. Every person has the right to criticize a judgment. Journalism in India today and the media as a whole is going through something of a crisis. People who read newspapers, who listen to what's happening on the radio, who watch television, who use the internet, you are well aware of the fact that journalism in India today and the media as a whole is going through something of a crisis. And I will attempt to focus on what I believe are 4 or 5 broad challenges that we are dealing with, and that the media in India is dealing with. And in fact, I would say the media around the world, because why confine ourselves to what's happening in India? The fact is that many of the challenges that we face are being faced by colleagues in different countries. Many of the opportunities that technology provides us are available to colleagues around the world. And there's every reason for us to want to learn from each other's experiences. But for the purposes of today's lecture, I thought I would focus on 4 or 5 broad themes and of course fill them in with details. Broadly under the rubric of challenges that we face. And I hope by the end of the lecture to have given you an honest and objective account, a sobering one, but perhaps not one that is going to deter you. In fact, I am a believer in the possibility of independent journalism surviving and thriving in India, even under these very difficult times. And I hope to leave you with some sense of optimism for the future, even though the challenges we face should not be minimized in any way. And let me start with the most obvious. The first challenge will be the most obvious one, which is the political attitude of those who are in power towards independent journalism. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that a government, any government, would be very, very mindful of what appears in newspapers or what comes on TV as far as news goes on the internet. Every government has, or at least in our part of the world, PR departments, publicity, external publicity, press and information bureaus with the view to putting forward the government's point of view. And the fact is that it is not the job of the media to put forward the government's point of view. This is not to say that if the government says or does something, we will not or should not report it. But media in a democracy cannot be reduced to being a mouthpiece of the government. The media in a democracy derives its mandate not from the government, but from the people, from the Constitution, from constitutionally guaranteed freedoms that all of us enjoy. In India, you know that Article 19 guarantees every person the freedom of speech. And even though freedom of the press is not explicitly written into the Constitution, the way it is in some countries, the fact is that courts have rightly interpreted Article 19 to extend to freedom of press. So the freedom of speech that every individual enjoys is enjoyed collectively by the press, by the media, and again subjected to the same set of reasonable restrictions that Article 19 introduced through, you should all know this, the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution. And these restrictions at one level seem very broad, but again the manner in which they have been interpreted over the years by courts has given the media a great deal of latitude, a great deal of freedom in being able to write and report without the fear of prosecution by the state. And it's not that governments have been happy with media coverage and not tried to suppress things. They have. There have been dark moments in the past when governments have tried explicit censorship, for example, during Indira Gandhi's emergency. And it's not as if governments don't have other means of putting pressure, and I'll discuss some of those. But it is my belief, my experience, and the experience of my colleagues that we are passing through a situation in India today where the extent of government hostility is at the highest it has been for years, for decades. Where the extent of government intolerance towards independent reporting has reached unimaginable proportions. And where the government's unwillingness to permit the broadcast of news and views, certain issues, has reached the level where, without declaring formal censorship, we are virtually at the doorstep of a situation where the government wants the right to tell every Indian what they can see, what they can read, what they can say, and what they can't. All of you are aware of the controversy surrounding the government's response to the BBC documentary on Gujarat called The Modi Question. I hope, despite the deletion of YouTube links and Twitter links, the journalism students of Kerala have been resourceful enough to be able to have found this documentary and watched it. In two parts. Part 1 deals with the 2002 Gujarat riots, and specifically the role of Narendra Modi, who was then Chief Minister of Gujarat and who is now Prime Minister. And Part 2 looks at the last 8 years of his rule, and in particular the last 4 since 2019. And the government's response initially to this documentary was to accuse the people who made the documentary of having a colonial mindset. And which is fine, and that's the government's opinion. Governments are entitled to criticize things. Governments are entitled to endorse certain things. We all know, for example, that a controversial film like Kashmir Files received tax exemption from virtually all BJP governments. And no less a person than the Prime Minister of India publicly endorsed and praised Kashmir Files. And he also said, and I applaud him for that people should not be intolerant. If you don't like Kashmir Files, you can make a film of your choosing that tells a different story. Which is the way things should be in a democracy. However, while the government was within its rights to denounce the BBC documentary as having a colonial mindset, as being false and untrue, etc., what it did not have was the right to trample upon the advice that Narendra Modi himself had given all of us when he was talking about the Kashmir Files, which is that this is just a movie. You can see it if you like, don't see it if you don't want to. And you have the freedom to make another movie if you don't like it. Excellent advice. But advice that Mr. Modi's government disregarded when it invoked a section of the Information Technology Rules of 2021 to direct or to order YouTube and Twitter to delete all links to the documentary. This was the closest the government could come to banning something that is on the internet. So it made sure that the video links disappeared from YouTube. It made sure that if you are looking for the video on Twitter, you will not find it, because it directed Twitter and YouTube to delete these, and it invoked its powers under the IT rules of 2021. In effect, banning the documentary, although not quite banning, because in the internet era, it's not an easy matter to ban something. And I would argue, in fact, that the government does not have any statutory power to do that. However, when students tried to watch this documentary on campuses, the response of the state directly in the form of the police in some places, but more importantly, working through supposedly independent vice-chancellors of universities, the response of the state was to widen the ambit of the ban and try to prevent people at large from even watching this on their phone. Today we've run the news in the wire of 8 students of Central University in Ajmer who have been suspended and expelled from their hostel for 2 weeks. Why? Because they watched the documentary on their phone. This is a serious attack on, of course, a citizen's right to free speech, to access information that they want, to their privacy rights, to a student's right to education. But issued without giving it a second thought by the Vice Chancellor of the university, and those kids have already been kicked out of campus and sent away for 2 weeks. I don't want to enter into a lengthy discussion about the documentary itself, but there is an aspect that concerns the media directly, which is this suggestion made, again, not officially. So there is no government document, there is no official letter, there is no government official or minister who is putting his name forward and saying, I am saying this. But we saw reports last week in a number of newspapers quoting unnamed officials of the INB ministry, saying that the reason why we are taking action against this film is because the Supreme Court is being insulted. The Supreme Court has already decided this matter. So how can you write and comment and criticize? Or this is going to cause Hindu-Muslim tension. And I want to remind all of you, and this is an important lesson that you should take when you leave journalism school and enter the profession. Courts are not beyond criticism. I'm not saying that the documentary does that. In fact, I would argue that it doesn't. But just like the Home Minister and various senior BJP leaders openly criticized the Supreme Court's Sabrimala judgment, wrote long articles about it, eventually managed to get it reversed in some ways. Every person has the right to criticize a judgment. I've done it on dozens of occasions. The Supreme Court's Rafale judgment, the Loya judgment, the Ayodhya judgment, the Narendra Modi / Zakia Jafri judgment, which is the subject of this documentary. I've written pieces about it. I've made videos about it. There is nothing sacrosanct about commenting on a court verdict. As long as you do not, and this is important, as long as you do not question the motive of the judge, as long as you don't make accusations against the judge that she or he gave this verdict for this and this reason. That you can't do, and you should not. But to say that the judgment is not a good one, to say that it's wrong, to say that it has ignored 10 pieces of evidence, is the democratic right of every person. It's the right of somebody commenting in the media. How can you make that the reason to ban something? It's absurd. And if we allow this logic to pass, then tomorrow the media will have no right other than to report on court proceedings and to comment on court proceedings like a court stenographer. But that's not the job of the media. And if that was the job, if that is to be the job of the media, then there are judgments of all kinds issued by courts at different levels that have been scandalous. Does that mean that we were wrong to write about them, to comment on them, to discuss them, to analyze them? It's absurd. There is no statute. The other argument given is that this is a 20-year-old problem. What I don't understand is if the Home Minister of India, during the Gujarat elections, can speak about the 2002 riots, then it's not considered an old issue. Nobody accuses him of raking up the past. But if somebody else does it with a critical eye, then all hell breaks loose. What kind of logic is this? The reason I'm spending time on the BBC documentary is because this is, of course, the most recent example of a blatant attack on media freedom in this country. But also because of its wide-ranging significance and because it invokes and in a way has shown us the true danger of the IT rules. When they were promulgated in 21, The Wire was among those media organizations that went to court, challenging the challenging the virus of the IT rules and asking that the court declare this to be ultra-virus. In other words, violative of the Constitution. Because it gives the government the right to decide unilaterally what content can be deleted. Just to remind you what the IT rules say, under the guise of dealing with so-called reader complaints, every website and every social media intermediary, in other words, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube and so on, have been told that you must appoint a grievance redressal officer who will receive complaints from readers or viewers about stories that have been posted and address those complaints. If the reader is not satisfied, then the reader has the right to escalate that complaint all the way up to an interministerial committee of bureaucrats who will then decide whether this story should be deleted or not. I can't think of a more dangerous provision, and I'm grateful to the IMB ministry and its reaction to the BBC documentary for making it very clear that when we said this power is a dangerous power, we were making a theoretical argument. We were making a speculative argument that if this provision stays, it can be misused. I thank Mr. Anurag Thakur for misusing this provision today. Itself, when that IT rules set, when those rules are already being challenged in the court. Now the court can see for itself the precise way in which these rules are being used to delete content. And deleting content, why? Not because it is a threat to national security. It's absurd to think that a program made by the BBC can be a threat to national security. Not because it is critical of the Supreme Court, simply because it is critical and shows, in many ways, some would argue, the current Prime Minister in bad light. There is a telling line in that first part. Maybe that's the reason why Mr. Modi doesn't like it so much. Where the BBC journalist asks him, that with the benefit of hindsight, this is when Mr. Modi is Chief Minister. And this recording was made maybe in April 2002. She asked Mr. Modi, after first telling him that there's been a lot of criticism about the handling of the violence and the fact that so many people were killed and so on. She asked him, and he denies all of that. She asked him, would you have done anything differently? And he says, yes. I would have handled the media differently. And the reason he said that is because the 2002 violence was in many ways the first time that the Indian media fearlessly covered on an ongoing basis the communal violence as it was happening. Most of you are too young to remember or even to have read about the 1984 massacre of Sikhs in Delhi. When, after Mrs. Gandhi was killed, it was a Congress government in those days, more than 3,000 Sikhs were massacred in the capital city alone, with the police standing by and watching, and with the participation of politicians, ruling party, Congress party politicians. The media at that time, sadly, did not tell the people of India the truth of what was happening. The fact that this violence was organized, it was orchestrated, that there was full complicity of the police and the ruling party, all of this was hidden from the public by the media of India. There was no television in those days. Our newspapers did a terrible job. Many national newspapers even tried to justify the killing of Sikhs. And it was only thanks to a report by the People's Union for Civil Liberties and the People's Union for Democratic Rights at the end of 1984 that the first systematic documentation about the role of Congress party politicians and the role of the police began to be assembled. A job that the media was meant to do, and which it didn't, was done by human rights activists. The kind of people who today get labeled as urban naxals. They were active then too, and they did a very good job. But in 2002, I suppose some lessons had been learned. Television news had also started. And the violence from the Godhra train fire onwards, Gulbarg Society massacre, Naroda Patia, lots of other incidents that were happening, were shown live on TV. And people were asking questions immediately. And what is the Chief Minister doing? How can he allow all of this killing to happen in his capital city if he's supposed to be such an efficient Chief Minister? If he's supposed to believe in good governance? Is this good governance that 800 people, or I think official figures are 1,200 people can be killed in 3-4 days? How is it possible that a former member of parliament tries to call every policeman he knows, every politician he knows, and including allegedly the Chief Minister himself, that there is a mob outside my compound, and yet nobody comes to save him, and he's killed? So it's the media which reported these things, and so it's not surprising that in April, when he's asked that in hindsight, would you do anything differently? He doesn't say that, yes, I would have tried to send police to Ehsan Jafi's house. Yes, I should have deployed or should have called the army earlier. Oh, I should not have allowed the Vishwa Hindu Parishad to take the bodies of the Godhra victims and use that to incite people. He doesn't say that. He says, I should have handled the media differently. And 20 years later, we can see what this handling of the media involves. As Mr. Rajesh or the other speaker said, I think you said about the no press conference. First time that we have a Prime Minister who has not held a single press conference. And when I began by saying that the first challenge to independent journalism is the political attitude of the government, this attitude is manifested from the top when the leader himself or herself adopts a hostile attitude, refuses to meet the press and take questions, refuses to give interviews except where the questions are all screened and prepared beforehand. Aap aam kaise khate ho? All that's fine. But when Karan Thapar asked back in the day, 2002, and this is a clip that I'm sure all of you have seen, asked him to respond to what the Supreme Court had said. The Supreme Court had called him a modern-day Nero. who looked the other way while the city was burning. So he first disputed what the Supreme Court said, and then he asked for a glass of water, and then he ended the interview. And since then, he has refused to give interviews in a situation where the questions are not somehow sorted out beforehand. You have ministers in his government who attack the media, call them, they use terms like prostitutes. And it is this political attitude of hostility that any media which does not serve as a transmission belt for what we want to say, any media which doesn't play that role is against me, is hostile, and liable to be proceeded against should the occasion arise. And I'll explain what that means. The fact of the matter is that despite India being a so-called free market economy, the media is governed by all kinds of rules, regulations, licensing. Radio, for example, there is no radio news in this country. It's quite shocking that Nepal, Bangladesh, you can have private news on radio. You have radio stations that are private and which give news. In India, and this is not the problem of Mr. Modi, this goes back to Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh. All of them had the same narrow mindset when it came to radio news. For some reason, they wanted to control it. So India is the only democracy in the world where you can have a private newspaper, you can have a private TV station, you can have a private website, but you cannot have news, private news on the radio. The licensing system doesn't allow it. Television is somewhat better. There is a provision for TV license under the Broadcasting Act, but the way this operates is highly selective and tightly controlled by the government. As we saw in the case of the Kerala channel Media One, where the government arbitrarily decided to terminate its license for reasons that it refused to disclose to the organization or to make public in court. Fortunately, the Supreme Court has stayed that entire process, but who knows how and when it may be revived in the future. The fact is that television stations, if they are seen by the government as hostile or critical in some way, there is enough in the licensing regime to enable the government to throttle your voice. And we have seen this power being used. This power also operates in other ways. For example, when Quint, which is a website, was trying to set up a TV station for broadcast, Raghav Behl was trying to do this, permission never came. But when Arnab Goswami was setting up Republic TV, permission was granted immediately. So this cherry picking of files, of applications, the government no doubt says it has some objective criteria, but we don't know what these criteria are. But the fact of the matter is that it gets to choose who can open a TV station and who can't. And if, as in the case of NDTV, somebody has a license which predates your Raj and is doing programs that you don't like, then you can have a situation where through some kind of a takeover, and the Adani group has bought NDTV, and already you can see some of the changes. People, I thought this was a joke on day one when the Hindenburg report came out. And somebody said, and instinctively, like when I have a few apps on my phone, And I saw a tweet, somebody sent me a tweet that Hindenburg put out. And I was curious to know, okay, has anybody read this report? What is the media coverage? So instinctively I pressed on the NDTV app on my phone. And of course there was nothing there. And a few hours later there were stories in some other media. And but for the rest of the day I didn't see any coverage. Of course NDTV later has done stories. But the fact is that Mr. Adani purchasing NDTV is bound to have an impact on the independence of that channel. So if licensing and regulating and those legal provisions don't work, there are other ways in which the system is able to change the voice of media. The problem of censorship, which I spoke about, in the context of the BBC documentary, is incidentally so acute that there was recently a conference held of senior police officers, Director Generals of Police and that level, where many of these police officers presented papers. There was one paper on the crisis in Ladakh because of the Chinese intrusion. There were papers on the role of Islamist and Hindutva extremist organizations. I believe some police officers also spoke about the need to keep a watch on the militant activities of Hindutva groups like Bajrang Dal and so on. And the minute media began to focus on some of these papers, it's news, right? I mean, if senior police officers are talking about this, it's news. The papers which were on a government website were all deleted, censored. So you can imagine if even senior police officers in this country are not safe from being censored, what the fate of independent media is going to be. Sadly, the challenges to independent journalism go beyond things like the IT rules or some instruction to censor a particular video or to delete a particular story. It has extended to the intimidation, harassment, and regrettably even the arrest of journalists. And today, I would say that we would be foolish not to recognize this as a major occupational hazard of being a reporter in this country. Our colleague Sidharth Kappan has been in jail now for 2 years and 4 months. For what? For attempting to do a story on the gang rape in Hathras. First charged under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, then under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. He gets bail despite getting bail, and I don't understand what kind of system this is. That you get bail from the Supreme Court or a High Court, in the case of PMLA, and the legal process to release you, which involves some complication of sureties, it's so difficult that weeks and months can go by and you can still not be released. Is this not contempt of court? But Kappan continues to be incarcerated. In Kashmir, Fahad Shah and Sajjad Gul, 2 journalists writing in English, arrested under the UAPA. One of them gets bail under UAPA and they are promptly arrested under the Public Safety Act, which allows the government to hold you for 1 year. No questions asked. The charge against Fahad Shah is so absurd, I can't resist sharing a small part of it with you. The charge against him is that in his magazine Kashmir Wala, he published 12 or 13 years ago an article by some professor in Kashmir, which was deemed to be seditious in nature. A 13-year-old article becomes a reason to arrest somebody under the anti-terror law. Absurd. But if that is not absurd enough, as part of the police inquiry, and this is really hilarious, the acting editor of Kashmir Wala, who was a young boy called Yashraj, he gets a summons. Now Yashraj is around 27 or 28 years old. He was 13 or 14 years old when that original article was published. And the police summoned him to give an explanation as to why this article was published. This is the absurdity of the system, where journalists can be just harassed at will. Every day we come across instances of colleagues in Jammu Kashmir who do a story which the government doesn't like, and they get summoned to the police station. Why did you write the story? Don't do it again. So on and so forth. Masarat Zara, photographer, FIR against her under UAPA. Sana Mattu, leading photographer in Kashmir, no criminal charge against her, but when she tried to fly to the US to receive a Pulitzer Prize, she was part of a team of Reuters photographers, and she was one of the recipients of the Pulitzer. She stopped at Delhi airport, not allowed to fly, no reason given. And she is the fourth or fifth journalist I know from Kashmir who has not been allowed to fly out of India. Is this why Article 370 was scrapped? I thought we were told that Article 370 was scrapped so that the Constitution of India will fully apply in Jammu Kashmir. Which part of the Constitution of India allows the government to prevent a photographer who is receiving an international award and against whom there is no case from flying? So these challenges that the rest of us are dealing with is magnified tenfold in Jammu Kashmir. During COVID, a new trend started. Prior to COVID, the main legal challenge that you had to contend with as a journalist was defamation. That you write something or say something, and the government or some politician or some businessman files a defamation case against you. And the law in India allows for both civil and criminal defamation, but criminal defamation is not really a serious criminal charge because the police have no right to arrest you. During COVID, a number of state governments began to invoke the Disaster Management Act and the Epidemic Diseases Act in order to harass and intimidate journalists who were doing stories which showed the government in bad light. So Andrew Sam, who is the publisher of a Coimbatore-based local website called Simplicity, they ran a couple of stories on shortages in ration shops in Coimbatore. He was arrested by the police under the Epidemic Diseases Act. Absurd. Normally, in a democracy, a story of this kind should serve as an alarm bell for the government. Somebody higher up should see this story and then instruct the local officials to make sure that there is ration in the shops. But the publisher gets arrested. Zubair Ahmed, who was a freelance reporter in Port Blair in Andamans, on Twitter he questioned the Andaman police, Port Blair police, for placing a family under quarantine simply because they spoke to a COVID patient on the telephone. It's absurd, right? Why should he be quarantined for speaking to somebody on the phone? So he made fun of the Port Blair police on Twitter. He gets charged under Epidemic Diseases Act, under Disaster Management Act. And it took him a whole year and a half before he was finally able to get this stupid case dismissed by the Calcutta High Court. I don't want to talk about myself, but we have our fair share of cases for reporting that we've done, and we're dealing with it. But the problem for freelance reporters, for journalists and publications in different parts of India can be huge when the full might of the local police and administration is deployed against you because you're doing your job. Kishore Chandra Wankhem in Manipur spent several months in jail because he wrote a satirical post after a BJP leader died of COVID, questioning the utility of cow dung and cow urine as a cure for COVID. Now, a lot of the BJP guys apparently were saying this, that cow dung will help, cow urine will help. So when this guy died, Kishore Chandra Wankhem said, what happened? He gets arrested under, I think, the National Security Act. In Gujarat, the editor of a local website called Dhaval Patel, 2 years ago, booked under sedition when Vijay Rupani was Chief Minister for a speculative article that Rupani may be dropped. Sedition. Vinod Jose, Rajdeep Sardesai, Mrinal Pandey, senior journalists, charged by the Delhi police for sedition, for alleging that a farmer who died in Delhi's 2021 protest, January 22 protest, had died of a bullet injury when the police was claiming that he was killed in an accident. How does this become sedition? So these kinds of charges which are being leveled against journalists, which attempt to criminalize the work that we do, is a new dangerous escalation in this attempt to silence the voice of journalists. And my fear is that this is going to grow as a challenge in the months and years to come. I've spent a lot of time on this first challenge, which is the challenge posed by the political attitude of hostility. And I have to say, even though I focused on the central government and the BJP, that virtually no state government is immune from this tendency. We recently saw in West Bengal a professor finally discharged from a case, 10-year-old case, because he had circulated a cartoon mocking the Chief Minister. Why should mocking the Chief Minister be the reason for a criminal case to be filed against you? Aren't we a democracy? This is not Russia, this is not Turkey, this is not North Korea. But the way in which politicians increasingly speak, the way the police operates, means that all of us have been thrust into the front line. The idea, of course, is not just to intimidate people like you and me, who are journalists or trainee journalists. The idea is also to intimidate at a much wider level people who use social media. Did you know, for example, in Russia, there is a law, and recently a prominent website that is critical of Putin called Medusa. This law has been invoked against Medusa, declaring it a hostile organization or some such. What this means is that anybody who helps Medusa is now liable for criminal action by the state. Anybody who likes a post, anybody who shares a post can be prosecuted by the Russian government. And it is this fear, of course the law in India will not allow, the constitution in India will not allow, and I hope the courts, should ever a government try to pass this kind of law, the Supreme Court is bound to strike it down. But this random process of arresting people because they posted something on Facebook, because they liked something, and we have dozens of such cases from around the country. The idea is to intimidate and make sure that you don't use your freedom of speech in such a way that is critical of the establishment, that is critical of the government. There are, of course, other challenges. I'll quickly run through them. The economic challenge is very, very high on the list. How does independent journalism survive? Who will pay for the journalism? Like, newspapers have a cover price. TV channels, if they are distributed through a set-top box, can levy some kind of subscription fee. What option do websites have? So a website can have a paywall. But hands up, how many of you in this room are paying subscribers to the Hindu or the Indian Express or Business Standard, which have a paywall? Anybody? Has anybody here ever paid to access news content? I didn't think so. Because the fact is that newspapers themselves are priced so low that we are not even used to paying for newspapers. You pay 3 rupees or 5 rupees for a paper, you sell it for Raddi at the end of the month, you get half your money back. So effectively there's no paywall even for newspapers. So if readers are reluctant to subscribe to websites, how is that website expected to survive? Well, advertising could be one answer. But advertising yields are very low. We run some ads on our YouTube channel. The Wire's YouTube channel has more than 4 million subscribers. We have millions and millions of views every month. But most of the earnings from the ads that play are taken by YouTube. So they make a lot of money. We don't make that much. Certainly not enough to stay afloat. We are fortunate at The Wire as a non-profit that we are able to collect donations from readers. Others are trying to get subscriptions. But the big challenge, because the only guarantee of media remaining independent, people often ask me, how has The Wire managed to survive for 7-8 years? Despite being critical, despite being independent, the simple answer is that we do not have investors. We do not have private proprietors. We do not depend completely on advertisers. We are a non-profit, we ourselves own our business. And we rely on reader donations. Normally the conduit for government pressure is the owner. If the government doesn't like the coverage of a news channel or a newspaper on certain issues, the minister can pick up the phone, call the owner, and things can change. So whether you remain independent depends on to a large extent on your ability to finance yourself. And there is no clear answer. There are different models that media around the world are experimenting with, but all of them rely on this one key ingredient, which is how do you get the reader to pay? Because if the reader does not pay, someone else will pay, and that someone else may one day demand their pound of flesh. A big reason why the bulk of Indian media has stopped doing its work is because of this business model. They're all owned by private companies, by families who have different business interests and who are running their media in such a way that they protect or extend their financial interests. They're very scared of government retaliation. A prominent newspaper group which did a very strong, bold coverage during COVID found itself being raided by the income tax authority a few months later. So these are all methods that the government uses to keep the media down, and this highlights the importance of having a financial model that will allow independent journalism to survive. The next, very quickly, issue or challenge is public trust. The fact is that the level of public trust in the media today is at an all-time low. Most people, Kerala may be somewhat of an exception, but a lot of people simply do not trust what they see or read. And the reason for this is because in a democracy they expect media to ask questions of those who are in power. But if media, because of its business model, because of government intimidation, stops playing that role, if it's going to stop asking questions to those who are in power, then it doesn't surprise me that the level of public trust in journalism as a whole will have come down. So reviving this public trust, getting people to have faith in what we publish, what we produce, is another big challenge for independent journalism. And the last point I wanted to make, because time's running out. The last point I wanted to make was the relationship between journalism and social media platforms. The fact of the matter is that a publication like The Wire is able to reach millions of people because of social media. What we write and what we publish gets amplified by readers through Twitter, through Facebook, through WhatsApp, through YouTube, through Instagram, and eventually gets seen by many, many more people than what we could have afforded if we were marketing it. Newspapers, television channel marketing is a very expensive proposition. Digital media, on the other hand, relies on social media platforms. But this depends crucially on the social media platform being an objective, principled player. Of course, social media platforms need to make money. But what we don't want is when the social media platform plays favorites, when the social media platform arbitrarily starts to censor content, or when they devise an algorithm that makes it harder for certain kinds of news to be shared or to be seen. And we know that all of this happens. I personally found it very, very alarming that Twitter, which under its previous owner had gone to court, in fact there is a case in Bangalore in the Karnataka High Court against Government of India by Twitter. And Twitter is questioning the government's right to order Twitter to take down tweets, and saying that very often your demands to have material taken down does not appear to be justified. However, the same company, Twitter, when it came to deleting links to the BBC documentary, was very quick in acting. I don't know if this is because this is Elon Musk's new policy or what it is. But if Twitter is going to succumb to government pressure, If YouTube is going to succumb to government pressure, if Facebook or Instagram are to succumb to government pressure, then this poses a very, very huge challenge to independent journalism about how to distribute its content, how to share your content. Of course, direct email, newsletters, all of these are very, very important methods of outreach, and we are experimenting with them, so are other people. But this tension between independent journalism and social media intermediaries or social media platforms is emerging as a major challenge. Many of these guys have monopoly power. Many of these guys, Google for example, uses the news content produced by news organizations and then earns a lot of revenue from it, which it doesn't share. So there are plenty of issues that media around the world is dealing with when it comes to the platforms. But I just wanted to flag this as another major challenge that journalism confronts. At the end, friends, I wanted to emphasize the fact that journalism, independent journalism, the media as a whole in a democracy is not an end in itself. It is a means of strengthening democracy. It is a means of empowering citizens. It is a means of informing people of what is happening in their society, helping them to hold government accountable, helping them to hold their representatives accountable. And an informed citizenry is the bedrock of any democracy. An informed citizenry is an empowered citizenry. And the link between being informed and being empowered, the link, it's the media that plays that role, which is informing and empowering. And if we are not able to face up to the challenges that I mentioned, of political pressure, legal pressure, financial pressure, pressure from the social media platforms, and if we lose the trust or are unable to retain the trust of the people, it is ultimately democracy as a whole which is going to suffer. Because media which shuts its eyes to what's happening will be of no use to citizens, to people, when their rights are being trampled, when decisions are taken which go against their interests. It's only an independent media, a fearless media, a media that is able to rise above these challenges, that can play its role as a watchdog and as a sentinel for citizens in a society like ours. Thank you very much.